What happens when a sitting governor comes on a talk show expecting a serious discussion about policy and instead finds himself being treated like a carnival act? What happens when someone who has dedicated their career to public service sits down with a host more interested in generating viral moments than addressing the real issues facing millions of Americans? Tonight we dive into one of the most explosive political confrontations in late-night television history, when Governor JB Pritzker walked into what should have been a thoughtful conversation about governing during crisis, and instead found himself facing a host determined to turn serious policy discussions into entertainment fodder. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, sharing your thoughts on what you're about to witness. Your engagement helps us continue bringing you these jaw-dropping moments from the world of politics and entertainment. The atmosphere backstage was unusually tense that evening. Governor JB Pritzker sat in the green room reviewing notes on his phone that outlined key policy points he hoped to discuss during what his staff had been assured would be a substantive interview about his administration's work. As the governor of Illinois, Pritzker had dealt with complex challenges ranging from budget crises to public health emergencies, and he believed that platforms like this provided important opportunities to communicate directly with citizens about the work being done on their behalf. The show's senior producer, a veteran of political television who had worked on countless interviews with elected officials, approached the governor with what appeared to be genuine respect for his office and his time. She had been briefed on the topics that would be covered, had reviewed the governor's recent policy initiatives, and seemed prepared to facilitate the kind of meaningful conversation that informed citizens and elevated public discourse. What she did not know was that the host had very different plans for the evening. In the weeks leading up to this appearance, the host's team had been pushing for what they called a more aggressive approach to political interviews, arguing that traditional, respectful discourse was boring, and that audiences wanted to see politicians challenged in ways that would generate social media buzz and viral clips. The host had embraced this philosophy enthusiastically, particularly when it came to politicians whose policies he disagreed with, or whose backgrounds he found easy to mock. On stage, the host was warming up the audience with his usual blend of political humor and celebrity gossip, but there was an extra edge to his energy that night. He had been building toward this interview all week, dropping hints on social media and in previous shows that he was planning something special for the governor's appearance. The audience responded with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from sensing they were about to witness something more dramatic than the typical celebrity chat. The commercial break announcement sent the familiar wave of activity through the backstage area. Sound technicians checked microphone levels, camera operators confirmed their positions, and production assistants coordinated the final details that would bring the governor onto the stage. But among the host's inner circle, there was a different kind of energy, a sense of anticipation that suggested tonight's interview would be unlike anything the governor had experienced in his political career. Pritzker rose from his chair with the composed manner of someone who had spent years in public life, accustomed to the scrutiny and pressure that came with elected office. His attire was characteristically professional, a well-tailored suit that projected the kind of serious authority that voters expected from their chief executive. The producer who escorted him toward the stage seemed increasingly nervous, her earlier confidence replaced by a growing unease about the direction the interview was planned to take. As they walked through the corridors that led to the main stage, Pritzker's mind was focused on the opportunity to address a national audience about the work his administration was doing to improve the lives of Illinois residents. He had stories to tell about successful policy initiatives, challenges overcome, and progress made on issues that affected millions of people. He believed, as many public servants do, that these platforms could be used to bridge the gap between government action and public understanding. The host's introduction was loaded with subtle digs disguised as biographical information, emphasizing Pritzker's wealth and family background in ways that seemed designed to undermine his credibility as a public servant, rather than celebrate his commitment to using his resources for public good. As Pritzker walked onto the stage, the applause was polite but felt somewhat manufactured, as if the audience had been primed to view him as a target rather than a guest worthy of respect. The opening moments of the interview followed familiar patterns, with Pritzker responding to questions about his recent policy initiatives with the kind of detailed, thoughtful answers that demonstrated his deep understanding of the issues and his commitment to finding practical solutions. He spoke about complex challenges with the clarity that came from actually grappling with real problems, rather than simply commenting on them from the sidelines. But the host seemed impatient with Pritzker's substantive responses, frequently interrupting, to make jokes that had nothing to do with the serious issues being discussed. Each interruption felt calculated to diminish the importance of what the governor was trying to communicate, turning policy discussions into opportunities for cheap laughs that revealed more about the host's priorities than about the governor's work. The first clear warning sign came when the host's questions began to shift away from policy and governance toward more personal attacks disguised as curiosity about the governor's background and motivations. What had started as a discussion about public service suddenly became something else entirely, something that made Pritzker's expression tighten slightly, as he began to understand that this was not the respectful platform for civic dialogue he had been promised. Pritzker's responses remained professional and measured, but there was a new edge to his voice that those familiar with political discourse recognized as a signal that his patience was being tested. As someone who had chosen to dedicate his wealth and energy to public service, rather than simply enjoying a comfortable private life, he was not accustomed to having his motives questioned in such a dismissive and disrespectful manner. The audience began to sense that something was shifting as the tone of the conversation grew more confrontational. What they had expected to be an informative discussion with their state's chief executive was becoming something uncomfortable, something that made them question whether they were witnessing legitimate political discourse or something that crossed the line into entertainment at the expense of democratic institutions. The host's true agenda became unmistakable as his questions grew increasingly personal and hostile, abandoning any pretense of journalistic inquiry in favor of what could only be described as a coordinated attack on the governor's character and motives. What had been presented as an opportunity for civic dialogue was revealing itself to be nothing more than an ambush designed to humiliate a sitting governor for the entertainment of a late-night television audience. Pritzker's composure remained intact, but those who knew him well would have recognized the subtle signs that his legendary patience was approaching its limits. His responses grew more pointed and direct, cutting through the host's attempts at misdirection to address the underlying assumptions and accusations that were being leveled against him. The contrast between the governor's substantive approach to serious issues and the host's preference for cheap shots and personal attacks became increasingly stark. The breaking point approached when the host made a series of comments that went far beyond legitimate political criticism and ventured into territory that was clearly designed to provoke rather than inform. These were not the kind of tough but fair questions that elected officials should expect to face, but rather personal attacks disguised as journalism, delivered with the kind of smug superiority that suggested the host believed his platform gave him the right to demean anyone who chose to serve in public office. Pritzker's response was swift and devastating in its precision. Without raising his voice or resorting to personal attacks of his own, he delivered a rebuke that exposed the fundamental dishonesty of the host's approach and the disservice it did to the democratic process that depended on informed public discourse. His words carried the authority of someone who had actually wrestled with complex policy challenges rather than simply commenting on them from the comfort of a television studio. The host's reaction revealed everything about his character and his understanding of his role in public discourse. Instead of acknowledging that he had crossed lines of basic professional courtesy, he doubled down on his disrespectful approach, attempting to frame Pritzker's legitimate objections as evidence of an inability to handle tough questions. His response demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the difference between holding public officials accountable and simply using them as material for entertainment. What followed was a masterclass in the difference between authentic public service and performative controversy. Pritzker did not need to resort to theatrics or personal attacks to make his point. His record of actual accomplishment and his commitment to the people he served spoke for themselves. Every attempt the host made to diminish the governor's work only served to highlight the contrast between someone who had dedicated his life to solving real problems and someone who seemed to believe that mocking those efforts was a legitimate form of entertainment. The host's desperation became increasingly apparent as he realized that his carefully planned ambush was backfiring completely. His questions became more aggressive and less coherent, his interruptions more frequent and less relevant to any legitimate public interest. He had wanted to create a viral moment that would generate headlines and social media engagement, but instead he was creating a moment that exposed his own lack of understanding about the role of media in a democratic society. Pritzker's patience, though considerable, finally reached its breaking point when the host made a comment that crossed every line of decency and respect for democratic institutions. The governor's response was measured but final, delivered with the kind of authority that comes from actually bearing responsibility for the welfare of millions of citizens rather than simply commenting on those who do. His words carried a weight that made it clear the conversation had reached a point where productive dialogue was no longer possible. The production team found themselves caught in an impossible situation as the interview spiraled completely out of control. The host's behavior was creating exactly the wrong kind of attention, generating the sort of controversy that reflected poorly on everyone involved and served no legitimate public interest. Executives who had approved this confrontational approach were now watching it implode in real time, creating a public relations disaster that could damage the show's reputation with both viewers and future guests. The host's final attempt to maintain control was perhaps the most revealing moment of the entire encounter. His words, intended to sound authoritative and dismissive, instead came across as petty and desperate. He had wanted to appear powerful and relevant by attacking a sitting governor, but instead he had succeeded only in demonstrating his own ignorance about the complex challenges facing elected officials and his complete lack of respect for the democratic process. The audience's reaction was immediate and telling. The nervous laughter that had greeted some of the host's earlier provocations was replaced by an uncomfortable silence that spoke volumes about their growing disapproval of what they were witnessing. These were citizens who had come to see their governor and instead found themselves watching someone attempt to tear down a public servant who had dedicated his career to serving their interests. The governor's decision became clear through his body language and tone, long before he made it explicit. He was not someone who would sit quietly while democratic institutions were mocked, and public service was treated as material for cheap entertainment. The respect he had shown for the platform and the audience was not being reciprocated, and he was beginning to understand that continuing the conversation would only enable further disrespect for the office he held and the people he served. The moment of truth arrived when Pritzker made his position clear through actions that demonstrated his commitment to the dignity of public office and the respect owed to democratic institutions. Rising from his chair with the same steady composure that had characterized his governorship, he removed his microphone and placed it deliberately on the desk, a gesture that was both simple and profound in its statement that he would not participate in any further degradation of civic discourse. The host's desperation reached its peak as he realized he was losing control of a situation he had created but could not manage. His attempts to frame Pritzker's departure as an inability to handle tough questions only served to highlight his own misunderstanding of what legitimate political discourse should look like. Every word he spoke in those final moments revealed someone so disconnected from the actual work of governance that he could not comprehend why a sitting governor might object to being treated as a source of entertainment rather than a public servant worthy of basic respect. Pritzker's exit was a masterclass in maintaining dignity while making a clear statement about the standards that should govern public discourse. He did not storm off in anger or resort to the kind of dramatic gestures that would have given the host material for future mockery. Instead, he simply refused to participate further in what had become a travesty of the kind of informed dialogue that democracy requires to function effectively. The studio fell into an uncomfortable silence as Pritzker walked toward the exit with the measured pace of someone who had made a principled decision and was comfortable with its consequences. The audience seemed to collectively hold its breath, sensing that they were witnessing something significant, a moment when respect for democratic institutions triumphed over the shallow pursuit of viral moments and entertainment value. Pritzker paused at the edge of the stage, turning back to deliver a final comment that encapsulated everything that had just occurred with the precision and gravity that had characterized his entire political career. His words were measured and powerful, cutting through the artificial atmosphere of the studio to address not just the host but the broader question of how public servants should be treated when they take the time to engage with citizens through media platforms. The host's final response was perhaps the most damning moment of the entire encounter. His words revealed someone so consumed with generating content and maintaining relevance that he could not understand why anyone would prioritize the dignity of public office over entertainment value. The contrast between his shallow opportunism and Pritzker's deep commitment to public service was stark and undeniable, exposing the fundamental disconnect between those who serve and those who simply comment on service. As Pritzker disappeared, behind the curtain, the studio remained trapped in an awkward silence that seemed to stretch on forever. The host attempted to recover with a joke about politicians being unable to handle real questions, but his words fell flat in the uncomfortable atmosphere he had created. The audience's response was telling in its absence, their silence speaking louder than any applause could have about their feelings toward what they had just witnessed. The production team scrambled to salvage what remained of the show, but the damage was already done. The host had revealed himself to be someone who fundamentally misunderstood the role of media in a democratic society, treating elected officials as targets for mockery rather than as public servants who deserved the same basic respect afforded to any guest. His behavior had backfired so completely that he had inadvertently created a moment that would define him as someone who prioritized cheap entertainment over informed civic dialogue. The credits rolled over a scene of uncomfortable aftermath, with the host sitting alone at his desk, while the audience filed out in subdued groups, many of them discussing what they had just witnessed with voices that carried disappointment and concern about the state of political discourse in America. The contrast could not have been more stark between the governor who had walked away with his dignity and principles intact, and the host who remained behind, surrounded by the wreckage of what had once been considered a platform for meaningful conversation. Somewhere beyond the studio walls, Pritzker was already returning to the serious work of governance, his commitment to public service unchanged by his encounter with someone who clearly did not understand the difference between accountability and entertainment. The host, meanwhile, was left to face the consequences of behavior that had revealed his true priorities to a national audience in the most unflattering possible light. The final image that lingered was not of political conflict or partisan debate, but of the profound difference between someone who had dedicated his life to solving real problems and someone who seemed to believe that mocking those efforts was a legitimate form of public discourse. It was a lesson in the importance of treating democratic institutions with respect and the danger of allowing entertainment values to override the serious business of civic engagement. What do you think about Governor Pritzker's decision to walk away rather than continue participating in this type of treatment? Should elected officials be expected to endure disrespectful questioning in the name of entertainment? Or do they deserve better treatment when they take time from governing to engage with citizens through media platforms? Share your thoughts in the comments below and make sure to subscribe for more incredible stories about the moments when public servants refuse to compromise their principles for anyone's entertainment.